Coming to the part 2 of Emily Dickinson's life and works. Emily was, however, attached to her brother Austen and his wife Sue. She also cultivated a number of intense intellectual companions. The first of them was Benjamin F. Newton, who was a law student in her father's office. It was he who introduced her to many stimulating books and authors, and also urged her to take seriously her vocation as a poet. It was Benjamin F. Newton who introduced Emily to the writings of Emily and Charlotte Bronte, and also to the writings of a feminist, Lydia Maria Child. The young man also presented to Emily with a copy of Emerson's poetry in 1849, just 2 years after its publication. Walt Whitman was, however, considered too immoral and wicked a poet for a young woman like Emily Dickinson. The early death of her first literary mentor as a result of TB was a great shock to the young woman, and one could sense the rationale behind her lifelong preoccupation with death. Later on, she developed an intense relationship with Reverend Charles Wadsworth of Philadelphia, whom she met in 1854. She began to regard the priest as her dearest earthly friend, and in her early poetry, she created the image of the lover, whom she knew only through her imagination. Wordsworth's removal to San Francisco in 1862 marked a turning point in Emily Dickinson's life. From 1862 onwards, her withdrawal from the life of the Puritan community in New England was nearly absolute, and critics are of the view that from 1862 to 1865, there was a remarkable upsurge of her creativity as a poet. Since her poems were not meant for publication and were only her letters to the world, it is not possible to date them with any degree of accuracy. Yet, there is adequate evidence that during 1862 to 65, Emily Dickinson wrote nearly 300 of her approximately 1700 odd poems. Although the publication of her poems was far from her mind, Emily Dickinson, however, had a budding poet's craving to find out if her poems were alive. On April 15, 1862, she wrote a letter to Thomas Wentworth Higginson, a professional man of letters, to find out whether her verses breathed. Higginson had been a Unitarian minister in Worcester who had resigned from the church and taken up writing literary criticism as a career. He had written the letter to a young contributor as the late article in the Atlantic Monthly for April. Emily Dickinson sent a couple of unsigned poems to Higginson and wanted to know if her poems had genuine literary worth. Higginson sent her a reply asking her to send some more poems, inquiring her age, her reading, her companions, and further details about her writing. However, Higginson's advice to James T. Fields, the editor of The Atlantic, was that the poems were not good enough for publication. They were too raw and fragile to be published in a popular venture like The Atlantic. Emily Dickinson, however, continued to exchange letters with her third literary mentor. The conventional literary taste of Higginson strengthened her resolve to keep her poems unpublished. She went on writing feverishly and kept her poems in packets away even from the eyes of her brother Austen and sister Lavinia. She went on writing in her own unconventional way, and the absence of the response of readers gave her the freedoms to stick to her individual style. She was, however, indebted to Higginson for the intellectual companionship and invited him to Amherst. She wrote to him, "You were not aware," she said, "that you saved my life. To thank you in person has been since then one of my few requests." This line has been taken from Introduction to the Poems of Emily Dickinson, edited by Thomas H. Johnson, the Belknap Press, Harvard University. It is unfortunate that when Emily Dickinson died in 1886, she had published only 7 poems, all anonymously. Emily Dickinson and when Higginson was of the view that her poems were too raw and fragile poems to be published, Emerson was of the view that she wrote as if she was suffering from fever. Perhaps she was born too soon, and it was only after her death that she got recognition. There is no wonder that 5 years after her death, her first book of poems went through 6 printings in 6 months. 12 years later, her poems were translated into German. By 1920, she had become one of the greatest poets of American literature. Before the emergence of Transcendentalism, there was the literary and philosophical movement of Romanticism, which started with the French Revolution in 1789 and ended around Emily Dickinson's year of birth. According to Nature, Dickinson questioned the Romantics' and Transcendentalists' idea of the relationship between the human and the natural world insofar as she regarded nature, for example, as completely indifferent in such lyrics as "Apparently with no surprise." Nevertheless, she appreciated the beauty of the natural world on its own, just like the virtues of the human material world. Different from the Romantics and the Transcendentalists, she was convinced of the existence of paradise on earth and did not search for it beyond the secular. In order to turn out that for Dickinson, the human and natural worlds existed on their own and without any mystical boundaries, a good example could be "A bird came down the walk." Poetic themes and strategies of Emily Dickinson's. Her poetic strategies are different from those of other popular American poets of the 19th century. Typically, she uses common meter, a 4-line sequence of alternating iambic trimeters and tetrameters, with the rhyme scheme AB, AB or AB, CB. Rhythmically, she breaks up the meter by using long dashes, slant rhymes, instead of exact rhymes and enjambment. Another stylistic device which distinguishes Dickinson from other contemporary authors is a knowledge of the German language and thus the capitalization of nouns. In order to create tonal expressions, she uses dashes very generously. Full stops, commas, exclamation marks, question marks, or quotation marks are used too, but only rarely. Thus, they also create great effect when used. One of the most important points that there is no doubt that critics are justified in claiming that Emily Dickinson's work is often cryptic in thought and unmelodious in expression. They were not appreciating it, but they also loved reading it. Almost all of her poems are written in short measures, in which the effect of curt brevity is increased by her verbal penuriousness. Compression and epigrammatical ambush are her aids. She proceeds without preparation or apology, by sudden, sharp zigzags. What intelligence a reader has must be exercised in the poetic game of hare and hounds, where ellipses, inversions, and expected climaxes mislead those who pursue sweet reasonableness. Now coming to an instance, a poem of hers, a few lines, which could seem less poetical, but this is the masterpiece of unspeakable sounds and chaotic rhymes. The title is Cocoon. Drab habitation of whom? Tabernacle or tomb, or dome of worm, or porch of gnome, or some elf's catacomb. So many rhyming schemes I could see, but every sentence we could see rhymes with each other. Whom, tomb, worm, gnome, catacomb. If all her poems were of this sort, there would be nothing more to say, but such poems are exceptions. The poems taken in their entirety are a surprising and impressive revelation of poetic attitude and of poetic method in registering spiritual experiences. To the general reader, many of the poems seem uninspired, imperfect, crude, while to the student of the psychology of literary art, they offer most stimulating material for examination because they enable one to penetrate into poetic origins, into radical creative energy. However, it is not with the body of a collected poems, but with the selected representative work that the general reader is concerned. Lyric melody finds many forms in her work. Her repressed and austere verses, inexpansive as they are, have persistent appeal. Slow, serene movement gives enduring beauty to these elegiac stanzas. An instance: let down the bars, O death, the tired flocks come in, whose bleating ceases to repeat, whose wandering is done. Thine is the stillest night, thine the securest fold. Too near thou art for seeking thee, too tender to be told. To sum up, Walt Whitman was a poet of the American Republic, and he celebrated both the freedom of the individual and also the community of workers and artisans. Emily Dickinson was a lady born in an aristocratic family of Amherst, and due to her intense love-hate relationship with an authoritarian father, she chose a life of utmost seclusion. While Whitman achieved a degree of fame and odium as well in his life, Emily Dickinson was practically unknown during her lifetime. It was only after her death that she got recognition. So we could see the contrast that one is quite famous and another is not, but eventually both are still famous and we still read their works, their poems. But unfortunately, what Emily should have seen or should have faced did not occur in her lifetime. The 1800s was a time of new and exciting change in literary culture in America. It was a chaotic time. The Civil War was supposed to happen in the late 1800s. And there were brilliant writers and poets who were mentioning the historical and literary background in their works. Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson are two of the most famous poets from the time period, who daringly revolutionized both the subject and style of the American poetry. While both are famous trailblazers, the two are vastly different. There can be a huge contrast that can be seen in their works. One is quite active, one is talking politically about slavery, is raising issues, is talking about politics, to even stay away from politics, and that person is Walt Whitman. But what is Emily Dickinson talking about? Her secluded life. She's contemplating, she's thinking that it's not worth living, and even if she is happy, she is still dealing with the chaos that is prevalent in her mind. The poets come from opposite backgrounds. Both of them are coming from very different backgrounds. And while they do write from some shared inspirational sources, they do so in distinctive ways. Together, they have helped to shape American poetry, and their influences can still be seen today. Whitman's progressive and liberal nature is seen in his work through both the style and content. He responded to Ralph Waldo Emerson's call to be more creative by abandoning poetic structure. So he wrote in free verse, with no meter or strict rhyme. However, he does play with other poetic devices, such as repetition, alliteration, and stanza breaks that give his poems life. Whitman wrote extensively about nature and the average man. He also wrote a lot about soldiers and war later in life. Walt Whitman's poems are generally long and winding with intense imagery. They also seem very personal, as if Whitman is telling you everything he has ever thought within his poems. Whitman does not hold back. In fact, his poems are sometimes too revealing, which garnered criticism, especially when the topic involved sex or the human body. Overall, Whitman can be seen as a bohemian who wanted to join the artists whom he admired, most notably Emerson, in literary fame. Emily Dickinson, on the other hand, was very structured and conservative. She was born into an upper-class Calvinist family, which meant that she never had to work. She was sent to a religious boarding school by her father, which she did not complete because she told her teachers that she had no hope. Dickinson lived with her parents for her whole life and did not leave the house much, leading to tales of her being a recluse and an introvert, even if she did not want to. However, she did have a few friends and possibly some love interests, which may have inspired some of her love poems. Unlike Whitman, Dickinson did not seek fame during her life. In fact, very few of her poems were published until after her death. Emily Dickinson's reserved personality translated over into her writing. She was very well read, in fact, influences Charles Dickens, the Bronte sisters, Elizabeth Browning, and even the Bible can be seen in her works. The poems she wrote indicate that she was fascinated with the concepts of death, love, and religion taught by Charles Dickens, Bronte sisters, and Elizabeth Browning in their works, and hence she was influenced. She explores these through the use of figurative language, such as the personification in poem titled "Because I Could Not Stop for Death, He Kindly Stopped for Me." Dickinson answered Emerson's call in a way that some would argue is even more creative than Whitman's style. Rather than throwing away all poetic structure, she added her own stylistic touch, more notably dashes and capitalization, which we will eventually see when we will talk about her works. Dickinson wrote in a very strict 14er meter. And what is 14er meter? It is a poetic verse known as a 14er and can be identified as a line of iambic heptameter that gets its name from having 7 iambs and 14 syllables per line. Now, this can be commonly seen in nursery rhymes and church hymns. However, within these poems, she covers serious topics and often surprises the reader with her treatment of a topic or the conclusion she draws from it. Overall, Dickens's style is rigid and stringent, but defies expectations in both style and content. While Whitman's flowing, carefree, hippie-like poems seem very different from Dickinson's rigid and sometimes ambiguous work. Both poets have two very important things in common. First, they both answered Emerson's request for poetry that transcends the everyday poems from that time period. As a result of this success in Emerson's mission, the second commonality was achieved. Both have become hugely influenced poets whose work still persists to this day. Walt Whitman's legacy is large, containing the likes of Langston Hughes and Allen Ginsberg in American literature. Dickinson's pervasive inspiration for both style and content can arguably be seen in the works of writers such as Sylvia Plath and E. Cummings. Both poets will be remembered as innovators who changed the landscape of American poetry by thinking outside of the box. And while we talk about this, we will eventually discuss how their works had influences of all these writers, and hence they became one of the most important poets and even writers of American literature of 19th century. And their works are still prevalent today, and we still read them, and the readers eventually reading them and get influenced from.